Hello, Alex. Good morning.
Hi, Veronica.
Are you okay today?
Yes, yeah, I'm doing fine. Yeah, I hope
Okay,
you are
great.
too.
Yes, as well. Really good to have you. Thank you for agreeing to take part in our interview. You are a known person in EAP circles, but we hope to have audience from outside of UK as well. So I will introduce briefly your profile, and then I hope we're going to have an interesting conversation about your work and how your work can help us thinking about development in EAP. So again, welcome. In today's conversation, I'm really honored to speak with Aleks Palanac, a leading voice in trauma-informed English language education and a dedicated advocate for refugee access to higher education. Aleks is based at the University of Leicester. She currently serves as head of sanctuary within the Sanctuary Seekers Unit at the Center for International Training and Education. Aleks has over decades of experience in English language teaching to speakers of other languages and also English for academic purposes. And she also helped to shape inclusive and responsive education pathways for students from refugee backgrounds. Aleks also co-founded RefugEAP Network, and she's a former lead and founder of the EAP for Social Justice Special Interest Group within BALEAP. So, Aleks, thank you again for coming today to talk to us.
And
I'd like
thanks
to
very much
start
for having me.
Thank you. I'd like to start the interview by just asking a simple question about your beginning in EAP. So, can you tell us a bit about your professional journey and how you came to work in EAP?
Hey, thanks very much, Veronica. So basically I studied English language and literature at university, and then immediately following that, in the summer after I finished, I did a few weeks of voluntary TEFL with a refugee charity based in Bosnia. And then I did various bits of volunteering back in the UK, and then I went to work for a refugee charity for a couple of years. After that, I did PGCE and went into ESOL teaching for Leicester City Council in local community centres. So I was doing a lot of work with local refugees, largely from India, Pakistan, Somalia, and I really loved this work. But then after having my second child, I needed to change my working pattern to times when I had available childcare. So, and my ESOL role wasn't really able to cater for that at the time. So it was really for quite pragmatic reasons at first that I first moved into EAP and did my first pre-sessional in 2011. Um, and I really enjoyed it. So then I picked up initially one evening class per week, like throughout the year, whilst also doing a bit of IELTS examining on weekends and some resources development for the new British Council Nexus website. And then I gradually picked up more and more hours at the university on a sessional basis as the children grew older. And then I did a Delta and applied for the full-time role as an EAP tutor in 2016. So that's basically the kind of very quick background.
That's really great because I think our sort of pathways into EAP, everyone will have a sort of similar story that you start on some sort of, ad hoc basis, get into it, and then you find your way in. Important. Thank you for that. So you mentioned a little bit of that already, but it'd be great if you could elaborate what drew you to integrating social justice into your EAP practice.
So when I first came into EAP, I already had that interest. As I mentioned, I'd worked
Mhm.
for some refugee charities in the past. And this interest partly came from my own family background of forced displacement in the Second World War and in the 90s. And another thing actually that really sticks out in my memory is after I made the move into EAP, a former ESOL colleague made a comment that I seem to have gone from teaching people with a real functional need for English, so including refugees, to teaching rich and relatively privileged international students. Um, so
Right.
that comment left
Okay.
me reeling a bit. But it did also then make me reflect. It made me think, okay, I wonder if there is a way that EAP can become more inclusive to people with maybe to more disadvantaged people who have a real need. Um, And that was also around that time. It was also the time of the European refugee crisis in around 2015, when the Syrian toddler Alan Kurdi was drowned, and he was found washed up on the beach of a Greek island. And then there was a lot of media attention generated around this, and there was a huge public outcry. And I kind of started thinking around this time, what can I do to help? Like, how can I use my skills maybe to help people who've been displaced? And I thought that the most impactful thing that I could do is to use my skills as an English language teacher. So I went along to a local charity, and I saw that there was an EAP need for some of the students at higher levels who wanted to progress onto university programs. So I mentioned this to the director of our EAP centre at the university at the time, and he said that he would be very happy for us to offer our classrooms and resources and some training to the tutors at that charity, which was great. I mean, I was really pleasantly surprised by that reaction. So then we began delivering these free English classes, and this led to starting to offer free places on pre-sessional programs for refugee students, particularly those who had come through those classes and who wanted a way to progress. And this led to offering places on like scholarship places on degree level programs and becoming a University of Sanctuary in 2018. So my main interest then was widening participation to EAP for refugee background students as a way to facilitate access to higher education. So at that point, I wrote an article called Renaissance of the Gatekeepers, and that was about how university staff, such as EAP practitioners, might start to reimagine their role as kind of gatekeepers to the university. So trying to find creative ways to help people into a university rather than adhering to rigid guidelines, which actually serve to keep vulnerable populations out of universities a lot of the time. But I quickly realized that widening participation isn't just about giving people access to something. You also need to think about the quality of the provision, like the nature of the provision that is being offered and whether it's fit for purpose. So it had been kind of slowly dawning on me at this time that, like, when I started teaching informal EAP classes to refugees at the university, I felt a sort of nervousness about whether I was going about it in an appropriate way. And that was reinforced in around 2017 when I went to Thessaloniki in Greece to do a bit of teacher training with volunteers who were teaching ESOL in refugee camps and community centres. And one of the recurring questions that the teachers were putting to me was, how do we tackle the issue of our students' trauma? So at that point, I started looking around, and I realized that very little guidance existed at that point in time about how to teach adult refugees ESOL or EAP in a trauma-informed way. And so that's when I started doing my own research into this area. So I wrote an article for Natekla's journal, Language Issues, called Towards a Trauma-Informed ELT Pedagogy for Refugees, which tried to kind of draw together insights from which existed from different areas of practice, like ELT, trauma psychology, positive psychology, and refugee studies. So I was kind of incorporating those insights into my practice and sharing these with others. So I was running like workshops for people, and I've now developed a free version, like a free self-access version of that workshop, so that it can be used by anyone who works with refugees across the world. And like, particularly when I did that, I particularly had in mind those original volunteers that I'd been working with in Greece, and just thinking that, you know, this sort of resource is very much needed, but it needs to be accessible, freely accessible by people like working in different contexts around the world.
Oh, this is amazing. Thank you so much. So it really looks like that sort of organic engagement with your own life, with your own practice, listening attentively to colleagues and reacting ethically and looking for a way to make your work and contribution to social life meaningful. I think this is really, really beautiful to see how EAP, which is usually positioned on this sort of economy-based end of education can be transformed if we listen, if we engage, and if we are willing to contribute. I think, yeah, thank you so much for sharing this journey. I think it's really inspiring. And we also want to have a link to that free resource. We'll add it to our resource section on the Padlet. Now, you again sort of started talking a little bit about my next question, because it's not just you doing things, but to be able to do all of that, you need to develop your own practice. You need to develop your own understanding. So, in the context of your own rich journey, how has your own CPD evolved over time?
Yeah, well, actually, thinking about this question, I'm kind of what springs into my mind is that there's two Hungarian academics whose work I was really influenced by when it comes to like my CPD development. So I'll just kind of mention both of those academics and how they kind of impacted me. So one of them was the late Professor Zoltán Dornier. And he gave a keynote at a BALEAP PIM in around 2016, I think, in Sheffield. And he was talking about his recent work on directed motivational currents in language learning and why it was that some students went above and beyond in finding ways to keep going with their language learning over sustained periods of time. A key concept that he mentioned was the Aristotelian concept of eudaimonia, which is like a feeling of rightness or centeredness that a person might experience when they live in accordance with their true self, their values, their principles, and their goals. So it was at this point I had a sort of realization that made me begin to see my work and my CPD in quite a different light from how I had before. So I realized that in order to be most meaningful and impactful, my professional development needed to be deeply intertwined with my personal development. So I was doing a lot of reading for personal interest around the topic of positive psychology at that time. So I was reading psychologists like Seligman, Csikszentmihalyi and Langer. So I decided to bring some of these insights into my own CPD. And it was around that time that I started moving away from reading to begin to make connections across disciplines and apply some of these insights to ESOL and EAP and to share these with others via conference presentations. So just to add, like before this point, I never really thought I'd voluntarily choose to do any sort of public speaking. But I found that this was made easier by the fact that I was really excited about the subject matter and the nexus between EAP and positive psychology hadn't been very much explored before, to my knowledge. So I felt like I might have something to contribute here. So the other Hungarian academic who influenced my thinking about CPD was Professor Mihail Csikszentmihalyi. So I read his brilliant book called Creativity and Flow, and you've probably come across this concept of flow. So it's a state that you might enter into when you become really engrossed in a task, such as playing a musical instrument or playing a game of chess. So, and the task is challenging, but not too challenging. And you become absorbed in it. You become so absorbed in what you're doing that other things around you kind of seem to fade away. And so Csikszentmihalyi explores how people who are engaged in creative pursuits might often enter this state of flow, and how creativity often involves putting existing things together in a different way. So at this point, I began, as I was kind of beginning a process of thinking and presenting and writing, I saw what I was doing as a sort of creative outlet that helped me experience flow. I was making connections across disciplines and using analogies to bring some of these to life. And I felt that my CPD was giving me a sense of creative fulfillment. So another thing that I did around this time is I decided to untether the idea of CPD to the idea of work or income. So I no longer saw CPD as something I was required to do for my job. It's something that I felt like I was doing for myself, like for my own fulfillment. And after that, it kind of took on a life of its own. Sorry, my dog has just decided to come and sit next to me.
Hello. Okay. Is Binny? Is that his name? Yeah.
Beanie, yeah.
Okay. Hello.
She's decided to join the interview.
Okay. For her own personal fulfillment, I hope.
Yes, yes.
Thank you so much. And really inspiring listening to you. and how you mentioned, that CPD is for our own selves, monetizing it or counting it within, within rigid hours of our work lives doesn't always help us to experience what we could if we engaged more deeply. And referring to the authors that influenced you, and sort of thinking about maybe sort of disciplines that are less traditionally associated with EAP. I think it's really refreshing to hear how, reading about positive psychology possibly could help us to reframe the sort of deficit thinking that is always associated with student effort, right? It doesn't have to be that they are struggling against their own lack of skills, but maybe they're just putting this, effort that is positive, actually. So if you look at that from a different perspective, amazing. Thank you so much. I, again, would like to have links to the books that you have mentioned in our resources. I'm sure others would like to look at those as well. So your CPD, a very, very rich journey again, and that led you to those two initiatives that I have met you through, actually. So the social justice in EAP, special interest group, and then also your initiative of RefugEAP. I would like you to tell us briefly about these initiatives, and also sort of reflect on how those initiatives, how engagement in those initiatives have contributed to your own personal growth and CPD.
Well, starting with the EAP for Social Justice SIG, I put out a call in I think it was late 2019 to anyone who might be interested in joining me in setting up an SJ SIG within BALEAP. And you were one of the people who responded.
On my maternity leave, yes.
Yeah, and you were on maternity leave at the time.
I was on maternity leave at the time.
That
yes.
that is commitment to the cause. So yeah, so that was quite a turning point for me. And so what led to that is that I'd been really inspired by the work of the IATF or Global Issues SIG, and also the growth and activism of the climate movement in 2019. The realization that no one's going to save us. So it's the responsibility of each and every one of us to take some action. I felt very kind of underqualified to set up a SIG focusing on social justice, as my experience up to that point had all been related to refugees and not really wider social justice issues. But I knew there was a real need for this within EAP. So I thought I might as well jump in and make a start by gathering together a group of people who could pool their expertise in different areas, and they could learn and grow together in this project. So that is exactly what happened. So there were 5 of us in this initial SIG committee, including you, and so we did learn and grow together, and we did encounter lots of challenges along the way, but this accelerated our growth. So a few weeks after we set up the SIG, the world was hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, and so we just in the 5 people within our SIG, we experienced illness, pressures of childcare, pressures of moving our EAP provision online. So all of these things were challenges, and they slowed us down at first. But we kind of developed a model of working whereby we each did what we could when we could, and then we kind of passed the baton to someone else. When we were struck by illness or something, then we passed it on to someone else, and there was always someone to keep things going. So that was such a brilliant and supportive and collaborative way of working. But then shortly after that, the Black Lives Matter movement erupted, and with the police killing of George Floyd in the US. So we felt that as an SJ SIG, we had a responsibility to respond to this and shine a spotlight on the issue of race and racialization in EAP. So this again was a huge learning curve for all of us, and sometimes this process of learning and making mistakes was painful. And cause us to kind of reflect on our practice, on and on our actions, and learn from our mistakes. So though there were many challenging times, pushing through these led to us learning and growing together, and being connected to this group of people during this work was such an amazing and enriching experience. So I suppose my main takeaways from that is that it's not necessary to wait until you feel like you're already an expert in something before you start talking about it and taking action. If you wait for this time to come, then you will be waiting forever. Sometimes you just need to jump in with a spirit of curiosity and openness, and you will learn on the way. And another takeaway is the huge value of finding your people, learning and growing together in a supportive community.
Yes, this is great. And I do remember that time really well. And yeah, the collaborations we had and conversations and meetings online and socials before Christmas. And then
Yes.
how we discussed that, I think, on a number of times, whether we are expert enough, and whether it's important. And yeah, I think this is really the essence of it all. Just don't wait and start doing. It's the doing that's important. And we learn through doing things rather than just waiting for them to come to us. So one of the
Yeah.
things that you did is the RefugEAP. So what led to the creation of RefugEAP?
Well, so at my university, so we opened up 3 places to refugee background students on pre-sessional programs, and I saw that we had a large number of refugees on our waiting lists for those programs. So I checked with a number of other universities across the sector, and I realised that very few were offering places on their pre-sessionals, and where they were, then it was only a couple of places here or there. So there was still like a huge pool of refugees who were waiting for places to become available on these sorts of courses. Around this time, I was also being contacted by people across the UK higher education sector, asking how we had gone about setting up our provision at Leicester. And also, I was being contacted by ESOL and EAP tutors from across the UK who were familiar with teaching online due to the pandemic and kind of being scaled up to do that through their own institutions. And they were asking me whether I knew of any opportunities for them to teach refugees remotely. So basically, just putting all these things together and looking at the level of the need and the level of the willingness of many people to get involved, that led to me having this idea of setting up RefugEAP, which could give people a structure or a framework through which they could contribute and also kind of engage in collective learning in this area. So so I basically set up 2 related strands of RefugEAP. So one of them is an online program which I developed alongside Deirdre McKenna from the University of Leeds. So this is basically a trauma-informed part-time EAP program for refugee background students who are based around the UK. And it's supported by a range of partner organisations and volunteer teachers. So far, we've run 4 cohorts and we've supported 127 students. And all of the volunteer tutors who participate take trauma training, and then they're encouraged to put it into practice in their sessions and also reflect on their learning and development in this area with other tutors. So that's the refugee program, but then there's also the refugee network, which is like a parallel initiative. And this is something which helps EAP practitioners set up and run pathway to higher education, English language provision for refugee background students at their own universities. So the purpose of the network is to give visibility to the issue and to develop an evidence base for what has been done before, to develop and share guidance for people wanting to set up similar provision at their own universities, and to provide a sort of network, like a forum for discussion. So we have a website, and we post regular blog posts on different aspects of this. And we run meetups to discuss initiatives and ideas, and we have a discussion, Gmail discussion list as well. So yeah, those 2 initiatives are kind of supposed to complement each other. So the end goal of it really is for the network to support people across the sector to build provision within their own universities, so that one day the refugee program won't be required anymore. So that's the ultimate aim.
That's a great vision, and I think very much needed in the current climate. You mentioned trauma training that some tutors are required to take. Would you be able to tell us briefly what is that trauma training that colleagues working on RefugEAP do?
Basically, so the version of the trauma training that they do nowadays is the self-access trauma training that I think I mentioned a little bit earlier.
Okay.
So it's so basically there are 4 short videos, so they come to like 1 hour in total, and then there are some accompanying activities and readings and reflective tasks as well, where people can think about how they apply these strategies to their own context. So the tutors basically do that, and then we have a session where we discuss this together and discuss how we might apply it. So I mean, the structure of that training is basically talking about aspects of the refugee experience that people who have refugee backgrounds might typically face, bearing in mind that everyone's exact experience is different. And then we look at what trauma looks like, and particularly how it might present in the language classroom. And then we look at different strategies for mitigating the effects of trauma in the classroom. So things like not forcing personalization, creating structure and routine so that people have a sense of sort of security in that classroom space, things like that. And then the training goes on to talk about post-traumatic growth and how we might, some strategies that we might use to try to foster that for students who might be ready for that step. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. How is it for teachers engaging with that training? Do they find it transformative? What is their reception of the content?
Some teachers who volunteer for Refugee might already have done a bit of reading around that, or
Okay.
might already have been working with refugees and be familiar with some of those concepts. So for them, it kind of reinforces things that they already know or that they've already been doing. For other teachers who haven't had that experience or kind of read up about it before, they have kind of given some feedback that they have found it quite transformative, particularly around things like not forcing personalization, because that's something that is kind of touted as good practice in ELT circles, like in the humanistic tradition, we're kind of told to kind of try to get people to personalize
Yes.
the language so that they're more likely to remember it and be motivated to learn it and use it and that sort of thing. So that's quite a insight, I think, for people when they first come across that. And other things like, trying to incorporate opportunities for students to demonstrate agency and to have choice in the classroom. It's something that some of us you kind of might already do, but it's very useful to frame that from a trauma-informed perspective, and to see that actually is good practice, because it helps people not feel kind of trapped. It helps for people to feel like they have some, at least minimal, control over one area of their life. What another thing that tutors have fed back on is that it's really helpful because we embed reflective activities for tutors as well within Refugee, and they have said that is really good to help them kind of synthesize some of the insights from the trauma training and how they're applying it in practice. That really goes hand in hand with the training itself.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's really great, because often when we talk about more critical approaches to EAP and trauma pedagogy is an element of critical pedagogy. I think one of the struggles that we often have is that we don't necessarily understand how to apply these principles in practice. So you talking about, trying to avoid encouraging students to personalize their experience or to talk about their own experience. I think it's something really powerful and really tangible as well. So thank you for that example. Right. So if we can move on to some challenges along your journey when you are working on integrating EAP social justice into EAP and critical pedagogy. What challenges have you encountered along the way? And maybe you can also tell us a little bit more about your current role as the head of Sanctuary, when you sort of lead on that practice in your university. So not just from, your perspective when you were beginning or learning, but now when you actually lead on that in your place.
Well, thinking about critical pedagogy, so one of the key insights from that really influenced me over the years is that all education is political, whether we like it or not. So what or who we choose to include and who we choose to exclude, so it can all be framed as a political choice. And I do agree with the idea that those who believe that education is neutral are in danger of replicating dominant positions of power, which are so often ingrained in us and in the system as to be invisible. So this insight has really influenced me in many ways over the past few years, but perhaps most strongly when it comes to the issue of Palestine. So I think this is an example I'd really like to focus on. So yeah, when I saw the genocide in Gaza begin to unfold in October 2023, I didn't speak out straight away, but after a couple of weeks of observing the events unfold and observing the silence around the higher education sector on this issue, I reflected on my previous social justice work, and I felt that it wouldn't be in accordance with my work and my values to remain silent on this. So in terms of challenges, I would say speaking out on this issue was probably the scariest thing that I've done. But it didn't really feel like much of a choice at the time. Um, I knew that there was a risk that I might lose my job for being vocal on this and that I might face hostility and abuse. But through my previous social justice work, I had learned a lot about the value of being a visible ally and of connecting together various struggles. So I knew there would be great value in doing this, whatever the risks were. Um, so being engaged in the issue of Palestine has been challenging in many ways, not least emotionally, but it has also brought me into close contact with a wide network of educators all engaged in this important struggle. The most amazing of these educators are those who are currently still on the ground in Gaza right now, still continuing to teach their students in the most brutal and devastating conditions of conflict and famine. Um, so for me, how we respond to the situation in Palestine is a sort of litmus test for us. It demonstrates the extent to which we really ascribe to the principles of decolonialism and universal human rights. And in my view, we as educators have a moral obligation to do everything we can to unravel the mainstream media or political narrative that manufactures consent for these ongoing atrocities, and to give our students the critical and analytical skills and opportunities to do so too. So I've recently set up a scheme called BALEAP as part of the work of the RefugEAP network to encourage UK universities to offer free places on their online pre-sessionals to Palestinian students still in Gaza. I'm hoping that the very act of widening participation to these often marginalised students will add a further critical perspective to participating EAP programmes.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. This is amazing. And the courage, that you need to have to engage with that. Thank you for sharing that. I think many of us can just learn from your example and try to see how in our own workplaces we can be that sort of similar agent to change and to stand on the side of those who just don't have the voice. I think it's important part of education. Thank you for that. This is really important. With all of the issues that you've mentioned, what advice would you give to educators who want to incorporate social justice principles, who want to find that courage within themselves, and bring that into their EAP practice and also CPD engagement?
I'd say doing some reading around the topic is a good place to start on this. So there's a few good books around. Well, in fact, many good books around, but I'm just going to mention a couple. So one of them is called Social Justice in EAP Context, which came out, I think, last year, and it's edited by Paul Breen and Michel Leroux. And there's lots of articles in there about various different types of social justice work going on in EAP and ELT. So that's a good starting point to give a wide kind of view of different ways to approach this topic. I mean, also, I would say key reading would be Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, and also Teaching to Transgress by Bell Hooks. These are two things that I read quite early on in my social justice journey, and they really influenced me. So I can add these to the resources list on the Padlet, and I will add a few more as well. I would also say, in terms of the social justice SIG, there's a really useful website with lots of resources, blog posts, recordings of previous events, Padlets. So I'd suggest for people to go along there and check out some of those things. Also, if you're particularly interested in refugee education, you could check out the Refugee Network website. And possibly also the self-access trauma training, and I'll add the link to the Padlet as well. But then there's a variety of other networks as well. So there's also a BAL social justice SIG that are very active. There's the IETF or Global Issues SIG and the ESOL SIG. There's also the Universities of Sanctuary network. If anyone wants to be plugged into a network that talks about sanctuary more widely. So EAP is one of the elements, but it also talks about widening participation concerns for refugees. Another thing that I touched on before is kind of getting involved in a program such as Refugee, but there's lots of other similar programs as well where you might volunteer to work with refugees, either teaching EAP or ELT, ESOL, maybe doing some mentoring. That's a great way. As I mentioned before, just getting stuck into something can be one of the best ways to learn, especially if you have a supportive network around you, and if some training is provided, and if there's reflection and discussion that goes on alongside it. So yeah, that's a great way. I mean, another thing which is slightly which is related is to join a union. So they also can offer very useful training when it comes to social justice issues, and there are opportunities to take action. This is particularly relevant in this period of like sweeping job cuts across the sector, and deep global instability on a number of fronts. But yeah, I mean, just wanted to finish by just really emphasizing the point that just learning and talking about social justice isn't really enough. When you're thinking about social justice, I always go back to thinking about what Freire said and his concept of praxis, whereby putting a theory or learning into action in order to transform the world is required. It's not just about learning about it. And sometimes, this might involve taking risks and being uncomfortable. I've definitely had my fair share of risk taking and discomfort over the years. But this is all good. It helps us grow as individuals. It helps us grow through our professional practice. And like I said before, we're stronger when we learn and grow together in this process.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So taking action really is what transforms our practice and connects us with people, with resources, and brings ideas. I think just generates ideas. We often, like when I reflect on my own journey, sometimes I think that sometimes I would sit and wait for an idea to come, and it's not coming. But then as soon as I start talking about the problem that it's not coming, it seems to be arriving from somewhere. So I think really just going out of your closet and reading, engaging, and taking courage to act when we feel that ethically it's important and we have the responsibility as educators to get engaged.
Yeah.
Is there anything I haven't asked and you'd like to add?
Well, nothing that springs to mind. But I would just like to say, thank you so much for including these issues you know, as part of this PIM. I think it's really important for these discussions to happen, and particularly when they're happening in forums like, or fora even, like PIMS or BALEAP conferences, then it's great because these discussions can then reach more people. And yeah, so yeah, thanks very much, and all the best with the rest of the PIM as well.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and I'm looking forward to hearing like some of the other discussions that happen.
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, we are really glad to have you. Often when we think about EAP or, you know, issues of refugees, it seems to be somewhere at the sort of periphery of what we do. But I think when we actually reflect and engage with students, we understand that very often it's a central part of their life. You know, each of us is displaced in some way, even emotionally. You know, even if you never traveled, you may be going through issues that are quite traumatic. So I think for all of us working more in the mainstream, understanding the issues and embracing the values and uncovering what education can be, I think it's so important. So I'm really grateful for your voice today. And I'll be uploading the resources to our resource section, and then I'm sure I'll be in touch as well after the interview. Thank you so much, Aleks.
And thank you. Thanks very much, Veronica.